Hey guys, Josh from Vertical Drum Co. here. I wanted to teach you a little bit about what snare beds are and why they're really important on a snare drum. We work with a lot of metal shells with a folded edge. So the drum actually would come up here and the edge is folded down into it. It's not a cut edge like we would do on a wood drum where we take it over the table router and cut our bearing edges. So with metal drums especially, we go with a really wide snare bed. And we make sure that they work nicely with the 8x14. If you think about the drum like this, upside down, so we've got this one pre-drilled and it's patinaed. You can see how the edge is perfectly true to this spinner that we have here. We don't have a lot of up and down. But when you flip it over, you've got the snare beds here. And I'm gonna show you guys with a flashlight so you can kind of see. This is where the butt plate's gonna be. And you can see how that edge is elevated. When you go around to the rest of it, it's not the case. That's still with the light back there. But then when we get to the next side, where our throw's gonna be, we have the same thing. We have this elevated edge here. And what that does, so that effectively is our snare bed. What that does is when we have our snare wires come down under the drum, that gives a little bit of a raised surface so that the snare wire can come across and contact the drum head. If we didn't do that, you wouldn't have the ability to stretch that snare wire perfectly flat across the resonant side of the drum, and you'd get a lot of buzz. So if we actually attached our snare wire across here where there's no snare bed, we have a perfectly true edge there, then what would happen is we'd have a ton of buzz. We wouldn't get that nice snare tone, and it would sort of just be clunky and annoying sounding. With our wood drums, we actually cut this in there. With the metal drums, it's just folded a little bit deeper. So super important on your drums to have a good snare bed. But the other piece of it is a lot of drums out there have really, really narrow snare beds. So you try and put a 42 strand wire on a drum that's not made for it, and you end up with a lot of issues. You end up with that same sort of buzz. So all of our drums, when we do snare beds on them, or with some of the pre-manufactured stuff, we have really wide snare beds to our specs. So we go lug to lug. Some of the other ones, you'll look at them and they'll be really narrow here. We want to make sure that we have really wide snare beds. You know, this one's even past the lug, so it can accept a 42 strand snare wire, no problem. I'm going to show you a drum that's already made and kind of show you how that works. So this guy here, you can see with a 42 strand snare wire how wide that is. Pull this off and show you here. So you can see with this wire, hopefully that's showing all right there, it's almost lug to lug. So if we don't have a really wide snare bed, then the edges of this are going to be contacting the drum head too high up instead of actually sitting down there. One of the easy things to kind of see is, you know, toss a flashlight under it, see what your snare beds look like. That's with no heads on, no hoops. Put it on a perfectly flat surface on a nice countertop or on some granite. You'll be able to see the shape of your snare bed and see how wide it is. But I feel like a lot of you guys are having issues with other drums out there not having very wide snare beds, and then you try and get that worship sound or that church sound and you put a 42 strand snare wire on there, and the snare bed's not wide enough for that wide of a snare wire. A lot of the traditional snare wires are 16 strand, maybe a 20 strand for something really wide, where a lot of worship drums we're going with really wide snare wires. A 30 or a 42 strand is pretty common. So it's really important that the snare beds on your drum are wide enough for your snare wire, and that you have something that has a pretty aggressive cut for your snare bed, or a pretty aggressive fold if it's a metal drum, to make sure that that snare wire is going to stay fully in contact over the drum. That's part of the way we get really good sounds on 8x14s with 42 strand snare wires. We have these really wide aggressive snare beds that accommodate the 4D2 strand. So hopefully that helps you guys as you're tuning your own drums and mess around with stuff, and gives you a little bit more info so you can analyze what's going on if the sound's not what you want. Take care, guys.